Hi and welcome to my video. Today is the last day of 2020, so for my last video of 2020, at least where I am, I'm going to do my worst and best reads of the year. And I'm going to do all in one video. I'm going to start with the worst and then I'm going to do the best reads. I'm going to try and put them in order with like the least worst to the worst and the least best to the best, if that makes sense. And this year has been a pretty productive reading year for me, considering I only sort of reignited my passion for reading mid-year, but it's been pretty productive so far, and I've loved getting back into it and loved starting doing booktube and having a bit of fun with reading, having people to talk to about books. So I'm going to get started. So I have 5 of the worst books I've read this year, and the first 2 I'm going to mention are DNFs, so technically they would be like the worst, I couldn't even finish them, but for the sake of this I'm going to leave a book that I fully read as the worst of the year. We're going to start with the 2 books that I DNF'd. So the first book that I DNF'd was Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk. I don't even know what to say about this. I read half of it. I got halfway through, so it's not like I gave up early. I got like quite far through into this, quite a big chunk of a book. It's like over 400 pages. I hated it. I hated it so much. I got it because everyone said it was so good and creepy and gory, and I don't mind gore. I like horror. And if you don't know who Chuck is, he wrote Fight Club, and it was awful. The idea of this is that it's made up of loads of short stories, but in between each short story there's like an overarching story as well. So there's like the people in the overarching story are telling their stories, which makes up the book, if that makes sense. It's very gross and graphic, and arguably the worst story is the very first one called Guts, which I'm not even going to talk about. If you've read this and you know what I mean. And I don't mind that. I don't mind it being gross and gory, but to me it felt like there was no point. It felt pointless. I didn't know why I was reading it. And it wasn't after the first story, because the first story was probably the most viscerally grotesque, the most that makes you feel stuff like it's happening to you. The rest of them just didn't have any punch really, and after the first few you're just kind of like desensitized completely to what's happening. So if you're not being entertained or grossed out by the gore, then you're not really getting anything from it, because the overarching story is just nonsense. And I've realised, as I'll explain more later on, that I don't like Chuck. I don't like his writing. I don't think I like him. I couldn't finish this, but credit where credit's due. Chuck can write gore really well. He's very good at making you feel uncomfortable and in pain. The next DNF is Ring. I actually made a rant review about Ring and why I DNF'd it, so if you want to find out more, please check out that video. But I had a lot of issues with Ring. This is a horror again. It is the book that inspired the films, the Japanese film Ringu and the American Western film The Ring. I was so disappointed, and I didn't finish this for moral reasons to do with one of the characters that I wholeheartedly disagree with. I'm not going to advocate or support anymore. I'm not going to talk about it anymore to, promote this author at all. I don't want to support him or promote it on my channel at all. So if you want to know more, watch that review, but this was not okay. So next is a book I cannot find. I do own, but I can't find it, and that's Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. Fight Club is obviously very well known. It's a film. It was made into a film. The film is better than the book. It's one of those rare occasions where the film is actually better, like completely actually better. I just really do not get on with Chuck's writing. I think he is obviously talented. He obviously writes really well. He's managed to make some very famous and well-loved writing, but he's just... I don't like his writing style. He writes very jarringly, I find. Like, he just has like random breaks in sentences or random jumps to different times or places, and it's just jarring. And the bits I enjoyed the most are the bits where he's describing something horrific or gory or gross, because he's so good at that. I'm not going to say about Fight Club's plot because I don't want to spoil it because I know people might not have seen the film, and I think you should watch it because it's really interesting. The book just didn't live up to my expectations. I thought I would enjoy it because obviously it's a lot to do with mental health, which I love, and the film was so good and entertaining, but the book just didn't cut it. And another reason I don't like Chuck Palahniuk's writing is that he cannot write women. I think the way he writes women makes me think that he hates women. Like, I don't know the man. I'm not going to accuse him or anything. I'm not going to slander him. But the way he writes genuinely makes me think he hates women. He writes women very poorly. He does not have any diversity in his men or women in his stories that I've read. He writes them really poorly. He usually writes them as like objects of sex. Because even in Haunted, a lot of the stories are sex related, but the female ones are very more objectifying than the male stories. He just doesn't write women well. I just don't like his writing. I appreciate that he's loved. I appreciate that people really value him and enjoy his work. I'm not one of those people. I will never read anything else he's done. Number 2 is You Should Have Left by Daniel Kalman. So I talked about this book, I feel like quite a lot already. So this book is actually a film as well. It's a short story. It's not even a short story. It's like, I don't know, an essay. It's really small. It's like a teeny tiny little book. And this was probably my most disappointing read of the year. It feels horribly unfinished. So in this story, you have a man and his wife and their daughter, and he's a screenplay author, and they go away to the mountains somewhere, in a remote sort of large, like Airbnb type thing, to get away so he can focus on his writing and I guess rekindle things with his wife, but because things are not going well between them, and then stuff starts to happen and there's something wrong with the house, and it's written as his like journal. The whole thing is just his journal. So then some things he'll write in his journal, then later on he'll be like, oh, I look back and I didn't write that, and it's creepy. And this could have been excellent. It could have been so good if it was actually finished, but instead it starts this like really slow build up and you're like, ooh, creepy stuff's starting to happen, what's going on? And then it just ends. It just sort of quickly wraps up and ends, and it ends on like an unfinished sentence, which I think is supposed to be like he's been interrupted partway through, which would have been effective if it felt like there was like something to finish. So disappointing because I was looking forward to it. You could just finish this in like half an hour, it's so small. I was so looking forward to it, thinking that this was something different and unique, and it was, and the premise was good, but it's just not good. It's not finished. It's not worth the money trying to get one of these as well. It's like the author just gave up and was like, oh, I'll just leave it there and pretend it was like intentional. Now for my absolute worst read of the year. I am so I'm going to try and reel in the drama. This is a book, a classic, probably my first classic, proper classic read of the year, and that was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Oh my god, this book was boring. It was so boring. I read it in October because I wanted something spooky to read for the like Halloween season, and it was so boring. I had such high expectations for this because people seem to love it and I just don't get it. It wasn't for me. If you haven't read Frankenstein, I'm sorry, I'm trying to laugh because it's just the mind boggles. If you haven't read Frankenstein, starts off as a dude exploring like Antarctica or something, I don't know, somewhere snowy, and he ends up rescuing Victor Frankenstein, and basically the story is him writing letters to his sister about the story that Frankenstein's told him. So it's just like story inception. Like story within a story being told to some dude's sister, and it takes a little while to get into actually Frankenstein's story. And then when he does, and like, it's just annoying. It's just a mess. You're just basically inside Frankenstein's head, and Frankenstein needs to like take a chill pill, like some diazepam, I don't know, because he's just like constantly just drama. He's just constantly going on. He's so melodramatic. He's like a young teenager. His emotions are so out of check, and it is written beautifully. I can understand why people appreciate the writing. The writing is beautiful, acknowledged, but Jesus, Frankenstein needs to chill. I just couldn't. It was just too much for me. Like, I love emotions and feelings, but that was too much, And you spend so much more time on Frankenstein, like dwelling on misery, than actually like with his monster, his creation. And this whole, I know the book is about Frankenstein, not the monster, but it is about the monster. It's about who are the real monsters, humans, obviously. And I would just spend the whole time like, oh my god, can you just get to the interesting bit with the monster? And you'd have like this small interesting moment, and then it'd just be back to Frankenstein and his melodrama in his own head. And oh god, I don't know how he lives with himself. He's insufferable. So that was incredibly disappointing. I wish I could explain more eloquently and coherently my feelings about this book, but they just kind of come out as like a sound in my mind. It's just like a little scream. I don't know how this became so iconic. I don't know how this became such an iconic horror. It's not horror. It's just a melodrama about Frankenstein dwelling on what a massive failure he is as a human, and he is. So those were my worst books. My number one worst, Frankenstein. Those are the worst books of 2020 for me. Ugh. I will not be rereading any of them. I will most likely be unhauling all of them. But on the plus side, I can take a breath. On the plus side, I have a lot of really good books. So for my best books of 2020, I've got 4 honourable mentions, and then I've got my top 5 books of the year. I suppose I could have done a top 10, but I didn't. But I wanted to do like 5 that were my best, and then like some honourable mentions that were close but not the best. And I probably missed off books. The more I look at the list, the more I'm like, ooh, I want to keep adding books, but I'm just going to mention the ones that mean a lot to me. There were so many other books I probably could have put on this list that were 5-star for me, but I just wanted to put the books that actually meant something. So for me, that makes a book the best book, is when it makes me feel stuff. But for honourable mentions, I want to mention 1 poetry collection and 1 book in prose, both of which I've talked about at length in other videos. The first is Don't Call Us Dead by Denez Smith. This is their poetry collection. I did a review of this and it is wonderful. I gave it 4 stars. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a really emotive collection. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because I've talked about it loads, but it's, yeah, absolutely wonderful collection. Very raw, very honest. Wonderful collection. The other book is That Reminds Me by Derek Owuzu. I've also done a review of this on its own, so I won't talk about it in detail, but this story hit me hard in the feels. Whew, I loved it. It was another 4-star. It wasn't quite 5-star, but it was just, it really got to me, and I just think it needs more hype. It's a debut. I don't know how these people are making such amazing debuts. It's just, yeah, needs to be read. Story in prose. Read it. Another honourable mention is a book that I listened on audio called Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter. I've talked about this a lot as well, and that is a wonderful thriller. That was a 5-star thriller. The reason why I haven't put it in my top 5 is because even though I thoroughly enjoyed it, it doesn't have as much personal meaning to me as the other books on my top 5 list. But it is fantastic. It's 5-star. It is a heartbreaking, engrossing, sort of very unsettling thriller that comes with a huge trigger warning to do with sexual assault and sexual violence. It's about women that are abducted and 2 sisters that investigate the abduction of young women after losing their sister, like, in their childhood. And it's just excellent. It had me captivated. I love the characters. The narration of the audiobook is phenomenal. It's so good. And yeah, so that definitely deserves a mention. The last honourable mention I have, Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendes. I've also done a review of this book, so you can check that out if you want more detail. This is also a debut, a fantastic debut. This is another 4-star read. I absolutely adored this book. This is a story about a young man who is disfellowshipped from his Jehovah's Witness community, and he runs away to London. And to find himself, to find his life, he ends up becoming a sex worker, and it's about his development. It's just a huge character development story, and it's just amazing. And part of the reason why Jesse's disfellowshipped is for being gay, and it's just excellent. And there is a lot of intersectionality between race and religion and sexuality and identity and all those things. Excellent. So good. I've talked about it before, I'm not going to talk about it again, but read it. So now for my official top 5 list of amazing books that I read in 2020. So the number 5, these are kind of in order. The top 2 are definitely like the top 2, but the last 3 are kind of a little bit interchangeable. But number 5 is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, and this is just so good. So everyone knows Poet X is about now. It's actually a young adult novel. I don't usually read young adult, but this is amazing. It is a story written in verse. So every like page, for example, in here, every page is a poem, a spoken word poem, and it's just phenomenal. We follow Xiomara, who is the Poet X, and her struggles as a teenager, as a woman, a young woman, her family and her religion, and it's just so moving and so good. The poems are so good. I've heard the audiobook's good, but I never listened to it. It's just a really amazing, captivating read. It's not even though it's quite a chunky book, it doesn't take long to read at all, and it just it just hooked me. I felt so many things, and it's just a coming of age that it was really beautiful, and all the sort of, again, intersectionality between race and religion and sexuality and gender and all those things come to play in this, and seeing Xiomara like rise and fall and rise and develop, and it's just really well done. Next, I have a book that I've done a review about. I feel like I've done reviews about most of these things. Is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Can't speak. This book is phenomenal. I did a quite lengthy, very clumsy review, which all my reviews are now. It's just my way of being, I guess. This book meant a huge amount to me, and I read it at exactly the right time. If you don't know, The Bluest Eye is about a young woman called Piccola, and her desire to have blue eyes. She's a young black woman. It's like early 1940s, like 1930s America, and she's just desperate for bluest eye. And it's about standards of beauty, internalized racism, trauma, intergenerational trauma, loads of things, and the story is told from the perspectives of other people in Piccola's life. So she hardly features like directly herself. It's usually about the people that have raised her and how that's impacted her and her mental health and who she becomes. And it is an incredibly moving, touching story, and it meant a lot to me as someone who obviously has experienced racism and has been made to feel extremely ugly as they are, and has not necessarily fulfilled the standards of beauty that are around. So this book just meant so much to me and left me thinking, and I still think about it. And if you want to know more about my thoughts on it, please watch my review. The next book I have is Kindred by Octavia Butler. This book was the first book I read in 2020, which was in July, because the start of 2020 was a mess for me. So this is the first book I read in 2020, and I was hooked. Like, I'm not a quick reader at all. I'm not a quick reader. I'm a slow reader. But I read this in like 3 days, but not like 3 full days, like a couple of afternoons was sitting, and I just powered through, and it was just hooked in. So Kindred is about a woman called Dana, or Dana, I don't know how you say it, I'm not American, I'm gonna call her Dana. Yeah, it's about Dana, and she travels back in time to her ancestors who happen to be slave owners, and she's black. Just throw that out there, and it's just like drama. It's so good. Octavia Butler writes science fiction, but it's in a way that's so accessible and so unique. It's so neatly embedded into the world, and it's just, because when you think of sci-fi, you often think of things like, I don't know, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, things that are very complicated and have huge canon and a lot of fans, and people really have to pick them apart, and there's so much to understand or not understand. This is pretty straightforward, but the premise is so interesting. She's from the 1970s, like, so modern day then, even though it's not modern day now, and to go back in time to slavery as a black woman is just, must be terrifying. And it was terrifying, and it's just so well done. And yeah, I was just hooked. I just needed to know what was going to happen. It was kind of brutal in the reality it showed as well, because I had so much hope for certain things. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I had so much hope for certain characters and their development, hoping that they would be something different or maybe change. And the reality is that of course they wouldn't. They were a product of their time, and there was people sometimes don't change. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And they didn't. And I remember feeling so disappointed and feeling, yeah, I don't know, and this sparked my love for her, and now I'm planning on reading like all of her work, because I just think her writing is amazing and I love her, and she just makes me care so much about characters. So we're up to my top two. So these two are kind of like neck and neck, but I have put them in order. But so my number two best book of the year, second best book of the year, is this little book here. It's by Audre Lorde. It's part of the Penguin Modern Collection. They had like a set of like little books. You can buy them individually, which is what I did. I just bought the ones I wanted for like £1 or less. But what they've done is they collected some poems and essays and little short stories of certain authors and put them into this collection so you can collect them. So this is by Audre Lorde. It's called The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. And in this there are 4 essays. So the essays are Poetry is Not a Luxury, Uses of the Erotic, I can't count, there's 5 essays, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, Uses of Anger, Women Responding to Racism, and finally, Learning from the 1960s. So there's 5 essays in this tiny little like 50-page book, and whew, I needed this. I read this very, very, very recently, like the other day, and I needed this so badly. So Audre Lorde is a poet and a feminist. She's a black lesbian feminist, as she states often, and she's done a lot of important writing. And she had breast cancer. She's done writing about that, and she's done loads. Well, she did. Pardon. She did do loads. I always talk about people in present tense, like they're still alive, whether they are or not. It's just a habit, but because her writing to me makes her seem still alive, I guess, but she unfortunately is not. And this came at the right time for me, especially the essay about uses of anger, women responding to racism. And that like hit me hard, because this year has been a test. And I felt a lot of anger, especially in December this year. I felt a lot of anger and hurt and upset. Because if you're not in the UK, you might not know what's going on, but there's been a lot of publicised racism to do with around Christmas time. So stores putting up Christmas adverts that have black families, and a lot of people making racist comments and tweets and racist complaints about this black family not being representative or whatever. And certain TV programmes, you know, that are showing support for the Black Lives Matter movement and getting complaints and being ridiculed. And I felt really hurt by people saying that, you know, like that they're sick of having like Black Lives Matter shoved down their throat. And I'm thinking, well, what privilege that you get to decide that or not? What privilege you get to decide that whether or not you think the lives of black people matter? Because it's not I hate people saying, oh, it's just a political movement. It's not just a political movement. It's real people that just want to be able to live without fear, without oppression. And the white people that are making these racist comments can't see that. They think that they get to decide whether they accept black lives as mattering, like, and it just drives me nuts. And this month has been pretty tough on me, and I've been feeling very angry. And reading her essay about anger, and actually anger being useful and healthy and just, and how to put anger into a positive use rather than keeping it in and keeping it self-destructive. Especially as a woman, we are not taught or socialized to express big emotions like anger or even upset. Like, you know, we're socialized to be very stoic, I guess, and hide our emotions, whereas anger is a very healthy emotion. I fully believe that anger is an emotion that we have that tells us when things are wrong. And Audre Lorde is like, we should use our anger to make change, because it's showing that something's not right and something needs to change. and she writes a lot about the experience of black women as feminists compared to white women, and how difference should be used together. We can't all be the same, and we shouldn't all try to be the same. All black women are not the same, or women of colour are not the same, or white women are not the same. We should be different and embrace our differences, but come together and with respect and understanding. And it just is exactly what I needed at the time, and I was feeling very heard reading this, and empowered and motivated, more empowered than I felt a lot this year. This year has been very crushing, and I felt like he just gave me what I needed. The other I keep saying poem. The other essay that I enjoyed was Uses of the Erotic, in which she talks about what it means to be erotic, to have erotic feelings, but not in terms of like sex, and how the word erotic actually is about deep emotion, but it's been socialized to mean like pornography or sex or something that should be hidden or shameful, and it's been minimized, when actually she argues that pornography is not erotic, it's actually emotionless, it's actually pretty empty and dead, whereas finding the erotic in your life is about finding pure satisfaction and happiness, and doing things that give you those feelings of satisfaction, where you feel good about yourself, and having these deep connections with yourself and with other people, and a connection that isn't selfish, it's not taking from the other, it's not using the other, it's actually connecting with and being with. And I really appreciate that, and it's just, I just think she's amazing, she's incredible. I read another poetry collection of hers this year, which I reviewed as well, and she's just incredible. Her writing was just so good, and this is just what I needed to feel heard and to feel a little bit empowered in a year that has been very disempowering for me, at least. So that meant a lot to me. So I talked quite a lot about that. So finally, my favourite book of the year, my best book of 2020 is The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. This is a reread for me. I got this book as a gift in April 2019, so April last year, and I reread it this year, and I adore this book. This might be one of my favourite books ever. I absolutely adore it. My copy is so battered. I've even painted the edges and it's just completely battered. But this book is incredible. I'm so glad I reread it. I feel like I'm in a place now where I can read things more deeply, and I'm more open to the emotional side of reading. So I just needed to reread this. So The Colour Purple is about a young black woman that lives in the South of America, so the American South, and it's between the wars. It's between World War I and World War II, so that's the testing time. And the story is written as her letters to God, so her prayers to God. She is filled with shame. She's a very abused young woman. She is regularly raped by her father. It's horrible. Lots of trigger warnings, by the way. I forgot to say trigger warnings. But she feels too much shame to say her prayers, so she writes them down. So every prayer from the beginning starts off as like, "Dear God," like she writes, "Dear God," and she writes her prayer, and that's what the story is. And then the perspective changes a little bit partway through, as part of the narration goes from it being Steely writing letters to God to Steely receiving letters from her sister Nettie, and then we hear Nettie's perspective and what's going on for her, and Celia's responses in her prayers. And eventually she stops writing to Nettie at all, not to Nettie, she stops writing to God at all, and starts writing to Nettie. And this story is about trauma and abuse, but also about growth and development and loss and love. We find that the Celie is attracted to women, so there's like queer elements as well, about understanding yourself and your sexuality. And it's about finding peace and contentment where you're at and with what you have, and having faith. And there's like religious elements, but the way they talk about religion in this is quite unique, I think, in that Celie sort of moves away from like traditional God, so Christian God, and finds the God or her faith in herself, in her family, in her work, and it becomes more spiritual in that sense, more open than what she previously viewed as like this white man in the sky that was gonna judge her when she died. And it was, it's just really beautiful, the story. It makes you feel so much. Yeah, I guess I don't even know how to explain how much this book makes me feel things. How much I fell in love with all the characters. My favorite character in this book is Sophia. So if you've read this, you know who I mean. She is badass, and I love her. She is just like the strongest woman ever, and I totally Sophia for life. But all the characters in this book, it was told purely, basically, from Celi's perspective in these short letters, and you get such depth and detail of characters. You get to know these characters so well, and it's just amazing. Like how can someone do that? Like, it's just so, they're all so fleshed out. Every character that you have contact with, it's fleshed out, and I just think that's crazy, because you're only getting one perspective. You're not getting like a third person perspective. You're getting one perspective, and you fall for all these characters, and you hate some and you love some, and they have huge character arcs, and every character feels developed and feels like they have movement and change and growth, because this book takes place over like 30 or more years, you know. And so there is time jumps, but it's done well as well. You always kept up with what's going on and where they're at, but it's not like, 10 years later she'll be writing and she'll be like, oh, it's been 5 years since blah blah blah, and you're like, oh, so now you're like, this has happened. And it's just an amazing story. And I know there's a film. I haven't seen the film, and I don't know if I want to, because the book is very emotionally taxing with so much content, and I feel like seeing that might be a bit harder, but maybe I'll push myself. But this book is amazing. It's definitely one of my favourites ever. This book hit me in the feels. I love it. It's what I needed as well. And it just gives me warm, fuzzy feelings, especially, like, I don't want to spoil anything, but the ending, all the feels. I had all the feelings. I needed to pause and be like, feelings. It's just, it's so good. But this video has been crazy long, and I can't be bothered to edit a huge longer video, so I'm going to have to stop there. But that was my worst and best books of 2020. I hope 2021 is another productive reading year, and I can read some more amazing stuff. I've read so many books this year that have just been so amazing and unique, and I'm just so impressed with the stuff that's been coming out and the debuts that I've been reading, and it's been really good. So even though there's been some trash, which we've spoken about, there's been some absolute gems, and it's been a good year. So I hope that everyone has had a productive reading year too, and I will see you in 2021. Happy reading. Bye.